October 2014. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of fallen maple leaves as New Haven police vehicles lined Elm Street outside the imposing Gothic Revival architecture of Yale University's Skull and Bones tomb. Detective Maria Santos was reviewing routine paperwork at her desk when the call came through at precisely 2:47 p.m. What began as a simple alumni dispute over missing fraternity documents would unravel into the solution of one of Connecticut's most haunting cold cases. The discovery of a leather-bound pledge book, forgotten in a basement storage room for nearly 6 decades, contained handwritten entries that would finally bring justice to a family that had waited 58 years for answers. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the diamond-paned windows of the university's administrative building as maintenance worker Robert Chen descended into the basement storage area beneath the Delta Kappa Epsilon house. His flashlight beam swept across dusty boxes and forgotten memorabilia when it caught the distinctive burgundy leather binding of what appeared to be an official fraternity record. Inside, among the typical college pranks and initiation records, investigators would discover entries dating to 1956 that contained disturbing details about the disappearance of 21-year-old Margaret Elizabeth Thornfield, whose body had been found in East Rock Park that November, her killer never identified, despite an exhaustive investigation. The weight of nearly 6 decades pressed down on the small evidence room as Detective Santos carefully photographed each page of the pledge book. The handwriting was clear, deliberate, and chillingly detailed in its descriptions of what the anonymous author called the perfect crime. Multiple forensic experts would later confirm that the ink and paper were consistent with materials available in 1956, and the deterioration patterns showed authentic aging. Most significantly, the entries contained details about Margaret's death that had never been released to the public, information that only her killer could have known. If you're fascinated by cold cases that finally see justice after decades, please like this video and subscribe for more deep dives into the details that mainstream coverage often overlooks. Margaret Elizabeth Thornfield was born on March 15, 1935, to Dr. William Thornfield, a respected cardiologist at Yale New Haven Hospital, and his wife, Eleanor, a former literature professor who had given up her teaching career to raise their 3 children. Standing 5 feet 7 inches tall with shoulder-length chestnut brown hair that she often wore in victory rolls fashionable for the era, Margaret had striking amber eyes and a constellation of freckles across her nose that intensified during Connecticut's brief summers. Her slender but athletic build reflected her passion for tennis and swimming at the New Haven Country Club, where she had worked as a lifeguard during the summer of 1956. Margaret was the kind of person who lit up every room she entered, recalled her younger brother Thomas Thornfield, now 86, in a 2015 interview. She had this infectious laugh and an uncanny ability to remember everyone's birthday. Even the mailman knew her name because she always asked about his family. Her sister Catherine, 2 years older, described Margaret as fiercely intelligent and determined. She was planning to become a pediatric nurse after graduation. She used to say that children deserved advocates who would fight for them when they couldn't fight for themselves. Margaret was a junior at Southern Connecticut State College, majoring in nursing with a minor in child psychology. Her professors consistently praised her dedication and natural empathy with patients during her clinical rotations at local hospitals. She maintained a 3.8 grade point average while working part-time at Thornfield Medical Supply, a small company her father had established to provide equipment to rural Connecticut hospitals. Her days typically began at 5:30 a.m. with a jog around East Rock Park, followed by classes until mid-afternoon, then work until closing. The Thornfield family lived in a stately colonial home on Prospect Hill, a neighborhood that housed many of Yale's faculty and New Haven's professional class. Dr. Thornfield's medical practice was thriving in the post-war boom, and Eleanor had returned to substitute teaching at local elementary schools. The family attended St. Mary's Episcopal Church regularly, where Margaret sang in the choir and helped coordinate the annual Christmas pageant. Their household income placed them firmly in New Haven's upper middle class, with annual earnings of approximately $8,000, well above the national average of $3,000 for 1956. Margaret's social circle included fellow nursing students, church friends, and a small group of young professionals she had met through her father's medical connections. She was known for organizing movie nights and picnics, often bringing together people who might not otherwise meet. She was a natural connector, remembered her close friend Patricia Williams, now deceased, in a 1985 interview. Margaret saw the good in everyone and had this gift for making shy people feel included. Her romantic interests were carefully supervised by her parents, though she had been casually dating James Morrison, a Yale divinity student, for several months before her death. New Haven in 1956 was a city of approximately 160 Zoll-Zaron residents, experiencing the optimism and prosperity of the Eisenhower era. The Elm City, as locals affectionately called it, was dominated by Yale University's presence, but also supported thriving manufacturing industries, including Winchester Repeating Arms, Sargent Hardware, and numerous smaller factories producing goods for America's growing consumer economy. The city's tree-lined streets and well-maintained parks reflected civic pride and economic stability that seemed to promise endless growth and opportunity. The social fabric of mid-1950s New Haven was tightly woven, with clear hierarchies based on education, family background, and economic status. Yale students and faculty occupied the highest social tier, followed by established professional families like the Thornfields, then skilled workers and tradespeople, with recent immigrants and minorities often relegated to specific neighborhoods and service positions. This stratification meant that most residents knew their neighbors and social circles rarely overlapped dramatically, creating a sense of community safety that would be shattered by Margaret's murder. East Rock Park, where Margaret's body would be discovered, was then as now one of New Haven's crown jewels. The 425-acre park featured hiking trails that wound up the prominent red sandstone bluff, offering spectacular views of New Haven Harbor and Long Island Sound. Local families regularly used the park for weekend picnics, and Yale students often studied under its ancient oak and maple trees. The park's proximity to residential neighborhoods and its well-maintained paths created an atmosphere of safety and accessibility that made Margaret's morning jogging routine seem perfectly normal and secure. The political climate of 1956 Connecticut was dominated by moderate Republican leadership, with Abraham Ribicoff serving as governor and bringing progressive reforms to state government. New Haven itself was experiencing significant urban renewal projects designed to modernize the city's infrastructure and attract new businesses. The construction of Interstate 95 was beginning to reshape Connecticut's transportation patterns, though its impact on urban neighborhoods wouldn't be fully understood for years to come. November 23, 1956, began as an unusually warm Friday for late autumn in Connecticut, with temperatures reaching 62 degrees by afternoon. Margaret Thornfield followed her typical morning routine, rising at 5:30 a.m. as her mother prepared breakfast in their Prospect Hill kitchen. At 6:15 a.m., Margaret kissed her parents goodbye and left for her morning jog, wearing her favorite grey wool sweater, navy blue skirt, and brown leather Oxford shoes. She carried a small purse containing her student identification, $17 in cash, and a silver compass her grandfather had given her for her 16th birthday. At 7:45 a.m., Margaret stopped at Kowalski's Bakery on State Street to purchase her customary Friday morning treat, 2 blueberry scones, one for herself and one for her study partner Jennifer Coleman. She was in excellent spirits that morning, recalled bakery owner Stanley Kowalski in a police interview. She mentioned being excited about Thanksgiving dinner and asked if we'd be making our special pumpkin bread again this year. Margaret arrived at Southern Connecticut State College at 8:20 a.m., where she attended her advanced anatomy lecture, followed by clinical skills practice until noon. At 12:30 p.m., Margaret met Jennifer Coleman in the college library to review for their upcoming pediatric nursing examination. Several classmates later reported seeing Margaret working intently at her usual table near the large windows overlooking the campus quadrangle. At 2:15 p.m., she gathered her books and told Jennifer she was leaving early to help her mother prepare for Thanksgiving dinner. She seemed perfectly normal, Coleman told investigators. We made plans to meet Sunday evening to finish studying. Margaret's last confirmed sighting was at 2:45 p.m. when she boarded the number 7 bus heading toward downtown New Haven. Bus driver Harold Peterson remembered her specifically because she always greeted him by name and asked about his daughter's recent marriage. Miss Thornfield was one of those passengers who brightened your whole day, Peterson stated in his police interview. She got off at her usual stop on Elm Street and waved goodbye like she always did. The bus route would have taken her within 6 blocks of her family's home on Prospect Hill. At 4:30 p.m., Eleanor Thornfield called Southern Connecticut State College when Margaret failed to arrive home at her expected time of 3:30 p.m. College administrators confirmed that Margaret had left campus on schedule, but no one could account for the hour and 45 minutes between her bus arrival downtown and when she should have reached home. Dr. Thornfield left his medical office at 5:00 p.m. to search Margaret's usual routes, driving slowly through downtown streets and checking with local shopkeepers who knew his daughter. The discovery of Margaret's body came at 7:20 a.m. on November 24, 1956, when Yale graduate student Philip Davidson was conducting early morning bird observations in East Rock Park. Davidson immediately noticed what appeared to be clothing partially concealed beneath a pile of freshly fallen maple and oak leaves near the base of the park's famous red sandstone cliff. Upon closer investigation, he found Margaret's body positioned in what police would later determine was a deliberately arranged manner, suggesting her killer had spent considerable time at the scene. The crime scene revealed a complex array of evidence that would challenge 1950s investigative capabilities while providing crucial clues for future analysis. Margaret's grey wool sweater had been torn at the right shoulder, and her navy blue skirt showed evidence of dragging through dirt and fallen leaves. Most significantly, her brown leather purse was discovered 23 feet away, its contents carefully arranged in a straight line on a flat boulder, as if displayed for discovery. The $17 remained untouched, immediately ruling out robbery as a motive. New Haven police detective Raymond Murphy, who led the initial investigation, documented several peculiar aspects of the crime scene that would prove significant decades later. Margaret's silver compass was found clutched in her right hand, though the glass face had been deliberately shattered. Her student identification card had been torn precisely in half, with one piece placed beneath her body and the other weighted down by a small stone near her head. Most disturbing, someone had used a sharp object to carve the number 7 into the bark of a nearby oak tree, though its significance would remain mysterious for 58 years. The medical examination, conducted by Dr. Herman Goldstein, New Haven's chief medical examiner, determined that Margaret had died from blunt force trauma to the head, consistent with being struck by a heavy object or thrown against the stone cliff face. However, the positioning of her body suggested she had been moved after death, and trace evidence under her fingernails indicated she had fought her attacker. Fabric fibers found on her clothing did not match any of her own garments, providing potential evidence for future analysis when technology advanced sufficiently to process such small samples. The immediate community response was one of shock and disbelief that such violence could occur in their safe, well-ordered city. St. Mary's Episcopal Church organized prayer vigils, and Southern Connecticut State College implemented new safety protocols for students, including mandatory check-ins for those living off-campus. Local newspapers provided extensive coverage, with the New Haven Register publishing daily updates on the investigation's progress and interviewing family members, friends, and college administrators about Margaret's character and activities. Are you watching this from a small college town like New Haven was in 1956? It's sobering to realize how crime can shatter any community's sense of security, regardless of size or economic status. The New Haven Police Department of 1956 operated with a staff of 47 officers serving the city's 160 Wallasuzanan residents. Detective Raymond Murphy, a 22-year veteran of the force, had previously solved several high-profile cases, including a bank robbery in 1954 and a series of burglaries in the Worcester Square neighborhood. However, Murphy and his team faced significant technological limitations that would hobble their investigation. Fingerprint analysis was available but crude by modern standards, DNA testing would not be invented for decades, and forensic psychology was still an emerging field with limited practical applications. The investigation's initial focus centered on 5 primary suspects, each with apparent connections to Margaret and potential motives for violence. The first suspect was James Morrison, the 23-year-old Yale Divinity School student who had been dating Margaret casually for several months. Morrison stood 6 feet 2 inches tall with dark brown hair and blue eyes, known among classmates for his serious demeanor and academic intensity. Investigators discovered that Morrison had grown increasingly possessive of Margaret, expressing displeasure when she spent time with other friends or focused heavily on her nursing studies. James seemed like a nice young man, but there was something intense about the way he looked at Margaret, recalled Patricia Williams, Margaret's close friend, during police questioning. Morrison's alibi for November 23rd initially appeared solid. He claimed to have been studying in Yale's Sterling Memorial Library from 2:00 p.m. until 6:00 p.m., preparing for comprehensive examinations. However, librarians could not definitively confirm his presence during the crucial hours between 2:45 p.m. and 4:30 p.m. when Margaret disappeared. Library records showed his assigned study carrel had been reserved, but student monitors acknowledged that tracking individual presence was inconsistent. Morrison was ultimately eliminated as a suspect when 3 fellow divinity students confirmed seeing him in a study group discussion that began at 3:15 p.m. and continued until after 5:00 p.m. The second suspect was Robert Chen's father, David Chen, a maintenance worker at Southern Connecticut State College, who had expressed inappropriate interest in several female students, including Margaret. David Chen, 38 years old, was known for lingering around the nursing building and making uncomfortable comments about students' appearance. Standing 5 feet 8 inches tall with black hair and brown eyes, Chen had immigrated from China in 1948 and worked various jobs around New Haven before securing steady employment at the college in 1955. Several students had reported feeling uneasy around Chen, and faculty members had informally warned him about maintaining appropriate boundaries. Detective Murphy discovered that Chen had been working on campus the day Margaret disappeared, specifically in the building where she attended her morning classes. Chen's supervisor, John Rodriguez, confirmed that Chen had been scheduled to work until 4:00 p.m., but had left early, claiming illness around 1:30 p.m. David seemed nervous that afternoon, Rodriguez told investigators. He kept checking the clock and said he needed to go home because his stomach was bothering him. Chen's wife, however, stated that her husband had not returned home until nearly 6:00 p.m., leaving an unaccounted period that coincided with Margaret's disappearance. The investigation into Chen intensified when police discovered he had been fired from a previous job at Yale University for allegedly following female students, though no formal charges had been filed. Chen was eventually cleared when neighborhood witnesses confirmed seeing him at a downtown pharmacy between 3:00 p.m. and 4:00 p.m., filling a prescription for stomach medication, and the pharmacist's records supported his alibi. Timothy Walsh emerged as the third significant suspect, a 25-year-old construction worker who had been employed on various Yale University building projects and had developed what colleagues described as an unhealthy obsession with college women. Walsh stood 6 feet tall with red hair and green eyes, possessing a muscular build from years of physical labor. Police learned that Walsh frequently positioned himself near campus areas where he could observe students, and several young women had complained about his persistent staring and attempts to initiate unwanted conversations. Walsh had been working on renovations at the Yale Medical School building, located approximately half a mile from where Margaret boarded her final bus ride. His supervisor, Frank Kowalski, reported that Walsh had been acting strangely in the weeks before Margaret's death, asking detailed questions about students' schedules and making comments about teaching college girls some respect. On November 23rd, Walsh was supposed to be working until 5:00 p.m. but had requested early dismissal, claiming a family emergency. Tim was always a bit odd, Kowalski explained to detectives, but that week he seemed especially agitated and distracted. Investigators discovered Walsh had no family in the New Haven area, making his claimed emergency suspicious. However, Walsh was eliminated as a suspect when hospital records revealed he had spent November 23rd afternoon in the Yale New Haven Hospital emergency room, being treated for a severe hand injury sustained while operating construction equipment. Medical staff and other patients confirmed his presence from 1:45 p.m. through 7:30 p.m. The fourth suspect was Dr. Marcus Webb, a 34-year-old psychiatrist who had recently joined the staff at Yale New Haven Hospital and had crossed paths with Margaret during her nursing clinical rotations. Dr. Webb, standing 5 feet 11 inches tall, with graying brown hair and hazel eyes, had earned his medical degree from Harvard and specialized in treating what were then termed deviant behaviors. Several nursing students had reported feeling uncomfortable around Dr. Webb, describing his interview techniques as overly personal and his questions as inappropriately intimate. Margaret had mentioned Dr. Webb to her friend Jennifer Coleman, expressing confusion about his behavior during a clinical rotation in October 1956. She said he kept asking her about her personal relationships and whether she had ever experienced inappropriate thoughts, Coleman told investigators. Dr. Webb's colleagues described him as brilliant but eccentric, known for conducting unofficial psychological experiments and maintaining detailed notes about hospital staff behavior patterns. On November 23rd, Dr. Webb had no scheduled appointments after 1:00 p.m. and claimed to have spent the afternoon writing research papers in his office. However, hospital security records showed his identification badge had been used to exit the building at 2:20 p.m. and re-enter at 5:45 p.m. Dr. Webb initially denied leaving the hospital, but later admitted to taking a long walk to clear his mind for writing. He was ultimately excluded as a suspect when his secretary discovered draft manuscripts in his handwriting that were time-stamped by the hospital's document control system, proving he had been actively working in his office during the crucial time period. The fifth and most troubling suspect was Professor Jonathan Hartwell, a respected member of Yale University's psychology department who had achieved recognition for his research into criminal behavior and mental illness. Professor Hartwell, 41 years old, stood 6 feet 3 inches tall with distinguished silver hair and penetrating blue eyes that colleagues often described as unsettling. He had earned his doctorate from Columbia University and published several influential papers on the psychology of violence, making him a sought-after consultant for police departments throughout New England. The investigation of Professor Hartwell began when Detective Murphy discovered that the professor had been conducting informal interviews with local young women, ostensibly for academic research into female psychological development. Margaret Thornfield had been among those interviewed, meeting with Professor Hartwell twice in October 1956 to discuss her career ambitions and personal goals. The professor seemed very interested in Margaret specifically, Dr. Thornfield told investigators. He called our home several times, wanting to schedule additional interviews, even though Margaret felt she had already provided all the information he needed. Professor Hartwell's academic reputation initially protected him from serious scrutiny, but Detective Murphy's persistent investigation revealed concerning patterns. The professor maintained detailed files on dozens of young women he had interviewed, including photographs and personal information that extended far beyond academic necessity. His research notes contained disturbingly intimate details about the women's fears, relationships, and daily routines. When questioned about Margaret specifically, Professor Hartwell claimed their interviews had been purely professional, but his files revealed extensive notes about her morning jogging routine, her family's financial status, and her romantic relationship with James Morrison. The case against Professor Hartwell seemed to strengthen when investigators learned he had no alibi for the afternoon of November 23rd. He claimed to have been grading papers in his Yale office, but department colleagues could not confirm his presence, and building security had no record of his access card being used that day. More troubling, Professor Hartwell had published papers describing the perfect crime and had lectured extensively about how intelligent criminals could evade detection by manipulating evidence and witness testimony. However, the case against Professor Hartwell collapsed when his wife returned early from visiting her sister in Boston and confirmed that her husband had been home with influenza the entire week of November 20th, 1956. Mrs. Hartwell provided detailed testimony about caring for her sick husband, and their family physician's records confirmed treating Professor Hartwell for severe flu symptoms during that period. The investigation's failure to identify a viable suspect led to increasing frustration within the New Haven Police Department and growing pressure from city officials, university administrators, and the Thornfield family. Detective Murphy expanded his investigation to include transients, recently released mental patients, and anyone with a history of violence against women, but no promising leads emerged. The lack of similar crimes in the area suggested Margaret's killer was either someone with strong local connections who successfully concealed his involvement, or an individual who had committed an isolated act of violence before leaving the region permanently. The revelation sent shockwaves through every level of law enforcement. Detective Sarah Martinez, who had inherited the case files just 2 years prior, found herself staring at conclusive evidence that pointed to someone who had been hiding in plain sight for nearly 6 decades. The DNA profile was a perfect match, Martinez explained to reporters. We ran it 3 separate times to be absolutely certain. There was no doubt we finally had our killer. The suspect's name was Professor Emeritus Harold Edmund Whitmore III, now 79 years old, a man who had spent his entire post-graduation life building an impeccable reputation as a scholar, philanthropist, and pillar of the New Haven community. At the time of Rebecca's murder, Whitmore had been 21, a senior psychology major, and member of the same fraternity where the pledge book had been discovered. His signature appeared on page 47, directly below an entry dated just 3 days before Rebecca's disappearance. What made the revelation particularly devastating was Whitmore's subsequent life trajectory. After graduating summa cum laude in 1966, he had pursued a doctorate in criminal psychology at Harvard, writing his dissertation on psychopathic behavior patterns in college-age males. He returned to Yale as a professor in 1972, eventually becoming department chair and a nationally recognized expert on violent crime psychology. For 4 decades, he had consulted with law enforcement agencies across the country, helping to solve hundreds of cases and train thousands of investigators. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit had utilized Whitmore's expertise on multiple occasions, including several high-profile serial killer investigations in the 1980s and 1990s. His textbook, Understanding the Criminal Mind, had become required reading in criminology programs nationwide. He had received numerous awards for his contributions to law enforcement, including a commendation from the FBI director in 1998 for his assistance in capturing the so-called campus killer, who had terrorized universities across 3 states. Perhaps most chillingly, Whitmore had maintained contact with the Collins family throughout the decades. He had attended Rebecca's memorial services, contributed to the scholarship fund established in her name, and had even provided psychological counseling to Margaret Collins during her darkest periods of grief. He held my hand at my daughter's funeral, Margaret had told investigators during one of their final interviews before her death in 2019. He told me that whoever did this to Rebecca was probably someone who knew her, someone she trusted. He said the killer was likely still in the community, living with his secret. The irony was suffocating. For 58 years, the very man who had strangled Rebecca Collins in that dormitory room had been offering comfort to her grieving mother, while simultaneously building a career based on understanding the minds of killers like himself. Dr. Amanda Reeves, a forensic psychologist who had worked alongside Whitmore on several cases, described the revelation as one of the most sophisticated examples of psychological compartmentalization I've ever encountered in my 30 years of practice. Harold wasn't just hiding his crime, Dr. Reeves explained. He was actively using his knowledge of it to advance his career and reputation. Every insight he provided into criminal behavior, every profile he created, was informed by his intimate understanding of what it feels like to take a life. He was essentially studying himself while helping to catch others like him. The investigation into Whitmore's life revealed a pattern of calculated manipulation that stretched back decades. Police discovered that he had kept detailed files on every major development in Rebecca's case, often obtaining information through his professional connections before it became public. When new forensic techniques emerged, Whitmore would casually inquire about their application to cold cases, always positioning his questions as academic interest rather than personal concern. Former students and colleagues described Whitmore as brilliant but emotionally detached, someone who could discuss the most heinous crimes with clinical precision while showing little apparent empathy for victims. He used to say that understanding evil required a certain emotional distance, recalled Dr. Jennifer Walsh, who had served as Whitmore's teaching assistant in the early 1990s. He would tell us that effective criminal psychologists couldn't afford to be sentimental. Now I wonder if he was simply describing his own psychological makeup. The arrest came at dawn on a Tuesday morning in October 2016. Whitmore answered the door of his elegant Victorian home in East Rock, dressed in his usual tweed jacket and reading glasses, a cup of coffee in his hand. According to Detective Martinez, his first words were not surprise or confusion, but rather a calm observation. I wondered when this day would come. The science has finally caught up with the past, hasn't it? Even in custody, Whitmore maintained the professorial demeanor that had defined his public persona. During interrogation, he spoke about Rebecca's murder with the same analytical tone he had used in countless lectures. She was an interesting subject, he told investigators. Highly intelligent, but naive about human nature. She trusted too easily, believed that education and reason could overcome any obstacle. It was almost admirable, really. When asked about his motivation for the killing, Whitmore's response revealed the depth of his narcissistic pathology. Rebecca represented everything I found insufferable about the changing social order, he explained. Here was this girl from a working-class background, being handed opportunities that should have been reserved for people of breeding and intellect. She was mediocre, yet she was succeeding through affirmative action and social engineering. It was an affront to natural selection. The confession continued for hours, with Whitmore describing the murder in clinical detail. He explained how he had lured Rebecca to the dormitory under the pretense of discussing a psychology paper she was writing. I told her I had access to research materials that could elevate her work from pedestrian to publishable, he recalled. Her eagerness to learn made the deception almost effortless. The actual killing had been spontaneous, according to Whitmore's account. She began questioning some of my assertions about intelligence and social class, he said. Her arguments were surprisingly sophisticated, and I realized that perhaps I had underestimated her intellectual capacity. That recognition made me angry, in a way I hadn't anticipated. The next thing I knew, my hands were around her throat. What followed Rebecca's death was a masterclass in criminal psychology applied to real-world circumstances. Whitmore had carefully staged the scene to suggest a sexual assault, knowing that investigators would focus on that aspect rather than exploring more complex motives. He had also deliberately left subtle clues that would implicate other students, including planting a cigarette butt from a different brand than he smoked and ensuring that his own fingerprints were absent from key surfaces. The fraternity pledge book had been the one oversight in an otherwise carefully planned cover-up. Whitmore had forgotten about signing it during the party 3 days earlier, and by the time he remembered, the book had already been collected by fraternity officers and stored with other organizational materials. I spent months trying to locate and retrieve that book, he admitted. I even volunteered to help organize the fraternity archives on several occasions, but I could never find it. I assumed it had been lost or destroyed over time. The psychological evaluation conducted after Whitmore's arrest revealed a textbook case of narcissistic personality disorder combined with psychopathic traits. Dr. Michael Brennan, the forensic psychiatrist assigned to the case, described Whitmore as highly intelligent but fundamentally incapable of genuine empathy or remorse. The evaluation noted that Whitmore's choice of career had likely been motivated by a desire to understand and control his own criminal impulses, while simultaneously feeding his need for intellectual stimulation and social recognition. Harold Whitmore represents the most dangerous type of criminal, Dr. Brennan explained in his report. He possesses the intelligence to avoid detection, the charm to manipulate others, and the psychological sophistication to compartmentalize his crimes while maintaining a successful public life. His greatest skill was turning his understanding of criminal psychology into a shield that protected him from suspicion, while enhancing his reputation as an expert in the very field he had violated. The trial began in March 2017, nearly 59 years after Rebecca Collins's murder. The courtroom was packed with Whitmore's former colleagues, students, and members of the law enforcement community who had worked with him over the decades. Many struggled to reconcile the gentle professor they had known with the cold-blooded killer described in the prosecution's opening statement. The evidence presented was overwhelming. Beyond the DNA match and the pledge book signature, investigators had uncovered a cache of materials in Whitmore's home study, including newspaper clippings about Rebecca's case, copies of police reports he had obtained through professional contacts, and a detailed timeline of investigative developments spanning 5 decades. Most damning was a leather-bound journal containing Whitmore's private thoughts about the murder and his observations about the investigation's progress. One entry, dated December 15, 1978, read, "Margaret Collins visited my office today, seeking guidance about persistent nightmares regarding Rebecca's death. I provided her with relaxation techniques while internally marveling at the exquisite irony of the situation. She thanked me for my kindness and expertise, never knowing that she was confiding her deepest pain to the very person who had caused it." There is something almost poetic about the symmetry. Another entry from 1994 noted, "The Collins case was mentioned during today's faculty meeting as an example of how cold cases might benefit from new DNA technology. I expressed enthusiasm for the potential applications, while privately calculating the statistical probability that biological evidence from 1965 would still be viable. The odds appear to be in my favor, but I should monitor developments closely." The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. District Attorney Patricia Chen walked the jury through 59 years of deception, manipulation, and psychological cruelty. Harold Whitmore didn't just murder Rebecca Collins, Chen argued in her closing statement. He murdered her twice, once in 1965 when he strangled her in that dormitory room, and again every day for 58 years when he used her death to build his career while tormenting her family with false hope and empty comfort. The defense attempted to argue that Whitmore's advanced age and contributions to society warranted consideration, but the argument fell flat in the face of overwhelming evidence and the defendant's own detailed confession. Whitmore himself seemed almost indifferent to the proceedings, occasionally taking notes and nodding approvingly when technical evidence was presented accurately. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning a guilty verdict on charges of first-degree murder. Judge Catherine Morrison sentenced Whitmore to life in prison without the possibility of parole, noting that his actions represented a betrayal of trust so profound and sustained that it defies comprehension. "You have spent nearly 6 decades hiding behind a facade of respectability while tormenting the very people you claim to help," Judge Morrison told Whitmore during sentencing. "Your expertise in criminal psychology, rather than being a mitigating factor, makes your crimes all the more heinous because it demonstrates the calculated nature of your deception." The resolution of Rebecca Collins's murder case sent ripples throughout the academic and law enforcement communities. Yale University immediately launched a comprehensive review of its hiring practices and background check procedures, while several professional organizations began re-examining cases in which Whitmore had provided consultation. The FBI announced that it would conduct a thorough analysis of every investigation in which Whitmore had participated, looking for potential instances where he might have misdirected investigations or protected other criminals. The Collins family's response to the verdict was bittersweet. Margaret Collins had died 3 years earlier, never knowing that her daughter's killer had been sitting across from her during countless conversations about grief and justice. Robert Collins, now 86 and Rebecca's only surviving immediate family member, attended every day of the trial. "I kept looking at him and trying to see the monster," Robert said after the verdict, "but all I could see was this old man who had stolen 58 years of peace from our family. He robbed us of closure, of healing, of the chance to move forward. My sister never got to see her daughter's killer brought to justice, and that may be the cruelest part of all. The case has since become a landmark study in criminal psychology programs worldwide, illustrating how intelligence and professional success can mask the most dangerous criminal minds. Dr. Amanda Reeves, despite her shock at her former colleagues' crimes, has written extensively about the case, arguing that it demonstrates the need for better psychological screening in sensitive professional positions. The Whitmore case forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth about human nature, Dr. Reeves wrote in her analysis. Intelligence and education are not barriers to evil. They can actually make evil more dangerous by providing it with better tools for concealment and manipulation. We must be more vigilant about the wolves who choose to dress as shepherds. The fraternity pledge book that ultimately led to Whitmore's conviction has been preserved as evidence and will likely become part of a museum display about the evolution of forensic science. The irony that a simple signature, something Whitmore had probably forgotten within days of writing it, ultimately brought down his elaborate, decades-long deception, serves as a reminder that even the most carefully constructed lies eventually succumb to the truth. As for Harold Whitmore himself, he remains in maximum security prison, where he reportedly spends his time reading scientific journals and writing what he describes as his memoirs. Prison officials report that he receives regular correspondence from criminology students and researchers interested in his unique perspective on criminal psychology. Even in incarceration, he continues to fascinate those who study the darkest aspects of human behavior. The Rebecca Collins case stands as a testament to the power of persistence, advancing technology, and the dedication of investigators who refuse to let cold cases remain forever frozen. It also serves as a sobering reminder that evil can wear the most respectable faces and hide behind the most impressive credentials. Sometimes the monster isn't lurking in the shadows. Sometimes it's standing in the light, wearing a professor's jacket and offering comfort to the very people it has destroyed. Today, visitors to Yale University can find a small memorial garden dedicated to Rebecca Collins, planted near the spot where Whitmore Hall once stood. The building was renamed and eventually demolished in 2018, but the garden remains as a place of reflection and remembrance. A simple plaque reads, "Rebecca Ann Collins, 1943-1965, brilliant student, loving daughter, forever remembered." It makes no mention of her killer, a final victory of light over the darkness that consumed so many lives for so many years.